Segun, welcome to the program. I am John Kane, and I've got Regan DeLoggins joining us here as well. And we are Resistance Radio. We decided, you know what, we might as well call it what it is. And to have two native voices in the New York City radio market. And, a lot of people talk about resistance. And, in fact, I've even heard native people say our existence is our resistance. And I don't know if that's true. I think we need to voice our resistance. And you and I, Regan, we have a different level of opposition to so much that is happening, not just in New York City or New York State or in the United States or North America, I should say, because we cover obviously a lot of the Canadian issues as well. Our resistance is different, and it's more broad based. It's more foundational. It's not just the idea of resisting a specific event or administration or it's much deeper than that. So I decided that I need to draw a little bit more distinction to what we are saying in New York City. And I know that's not an unfamiliar expression, resistance radio, but we're going to make it our own. So welcome to Resistance Radio with John Kane and Regan DeLoggins.
I'm so excited about the name change. When you texted me about it and we had a little bit of a discussion, I love Let's Talk. It's great. It's, casual and thoughtful, but Resistance Radio is the reality of the work that we do. So I'm happy for the name change.
Well, and that's why I wanted to seek your approval on it, because I think, clearly, it's even funny when people ask us and they pose a question, and we're going to talk a little bit about one of the callers last week, posing a question. I do want to tell people at the bottom of the hour, I got Bob Hennelly, who's going to join us, and Bob is, for those who don't know, is a prominent investigative journalist. He does freelance work, but his work shows up in Salon and City and State, inside New Jersey, and various other places. So we're going to talk a little bit about Trump's gutting of Atlantic City, how much he tried to throw native people under a bus as he entered into the casino industry and failed miserably. So we're going to talk about that and a few other things. But what I wanted to start the show with, I wanted to jump back into a conversation. And it's not that we were bowled over by a caller asking us to somehow parse out the difference between revenge and justice, but even the framing of that question, to me, it spoke yards about white people, basically, trying to make us behave ourselves, and for one thing, there is no justice, and we're not just talking about Breonna Taylor or George Floyd or Eric Garner. We're not just talking about that. When you look at the overall system, there's we get hit with this idea of justice, but in general, it's about crime and punishment, right? I mean, it's about the punishment that a police officer can inflict. It's about the punishment that a court can inflict. They even call it punitive damages. And those punitive damages don't go, there are, some damages that go to a victim of a crime, but then there's the court saying, no, we're gonna charge you a bunch of money, we're gonna fine you, and we're going to put you in prison, we're gonna punish you, we're gonna punish your body, obviously when we talk about capital punishment, we're gonna take your life. There is this idea of revenge, and that's but it's in the hands of frankly, the white, dominant culture of the United States. So when we talk about vengeance or and I don't even want to put it, cast it necessarily as vengeance or revenge, but equity. When I think about these boats that were burned up in Mi'kmaq territory, would it be revenge if a couple of those white fishermen had their boats burned up, or would that be equity? I think that's the question that needs to be had, right? So I want you and I to parse this a little bit farther, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I think that was important. I mean, I really appreciated the question last week because it led to a larger discussion. And for me, what I really want to hammer home in all of this, and kind of what I was alluding to last week, was that I think that justice can exist when full sovereignty and self-determination is practiced. Because I think that we can have justice when our nations, our bands, our tribes are able to define and really exercise what justice looks like. Because under the so-called justice system, which is, the settler colonial system, there, like you said, there is no justice, because in the end it focuses on imprisonment. And as we know, the carceral system is, deplorable and should be abolished completely, and participates in the larger problems of having a police force. So in the end, we have a justice system that focuses so heavily on punishment through a racist practice. So what does it look like for us to have justice? What does it look for us to have when we are able to exercise it within? And I'm saying like actually exercise it, because for those that don't understand, in order to be a federally recognized tribe within the occupied United States, you have to have certain legal codes that are accepted. You have to have like a constitution. You have things that are very much colonial ways of governance.
Exactly.
And so what I wonder is, what would it look like for us to have justice colonial assimilation tactics pressed upon us?
Well, and I just heard Chris Rock last night. He was on with Trevor Noah, and he raised an interesting point. He says, look, sitting at a lunch counter, that wasn't justice. That's what everybody, to think that was a huge accomplishment. And he's not deriding what took place in, with the civil rights movement, but to sit in the front of a bus, or to have the, no blacks signs removed, that's not a very heavy lift. And so now we're at a place where we're really talking about equity and justice. And now we're talking about tackling the systemic racism of a police department, or of the court system, or the prison system, or the election system, or all of that stuff. What took place in the civil rights era, those battles, King's work and others, that moved the bar, but it never even came close to approaching the idea of equity or justice. It was about eliminating a really, really low bar that we were oppressed by. And so I think it was, now we're talking about trying to affect real change. I mean, frankly, and this was his point. He goes, man, if I could have my kids grow up and have an equal shot at income, or at education, or at real for real justice, I'd give up sitting at the freaking lunch counter. So, and that was kind of the point that he was making. In the overall scheme of things, getting the lunch counter or the front of the bus was a pretty low lift.
Well, also, I think that it's important to understand that what people are taught in terms of the civil rights movement, and in terms of, are things like the bus boycotts, are things like the sit-ins, which, of course, important things that we need to definitely learn. But what they don't teach you is that the militarized, or the more militant organizations like Black Panthers, like Young Lords, like the American Indian Movement, and a number of, like the Yellow Jacket, like a number of different groups were systematically destroyed by the COINTELPRO FBI infiltrations and raids, and most of those people are still in prison. Some, like Assata Shakur escaped. Many of the Young Lords members still organize in both Chicago and in New York City. So we are taught those as moments. Like, you learn the Black Panthers quickly. You don't actually settle down as a student and learn that there were these radical and often righteously violent and militant groups that did really important work to move forward the narrative. But what we're going to focus on is the peaceful protests, because the peaceful protests placate the state. The peaceful protests maintain the status quo. It's necessary for us to be violent and militant in order to see and generate actual change. But that's not what students are taught. Like, even when they're taught MLK as a civil rights leader, they always push this peaceful protest. But what they don't really talk about is that he was violently murdered.
Yeah.
He was violently murdered. So there is no such thing as change through these peaceful these peaceful actions, and we definitely can't deaden or numb the legacy of radical Black and brown organizers who went above and beyond, creating their own systems of equity, of justice, of vengefulness, and also of thrive. We need to really start paying attention to those narratives more so than the ones that placate settler colonial history.
Well, and the whole love conquers hate thing. Yeah, that's a nice idea. But if you don't cast hate as wrong, I mean, if you don't cast the violence and meet that violence with something, of equal force, then you're again, when people talk about pacifism, pacifism is fine if you're choosing that means to oppose violence. But if you're defaulting to pacifism because you're not willing to fight, you're not a pacifist then. You're just weak. And I think that threat that we will fight back. And there's only one way that threat becomes, really tangible or viable is when we do fight back. And that's what we've seen. That's what we've seen throughout history is when you really affect change, it's because there are riots in the street and there is pushback. There is, at very least and this is very difficult for many listeners to wrap their head around. Nonviolent direct action is still being called violence because we topple a statue or because we deface a monument or because perhaps a vehicle or a building gets damaged. But that's not violence. I mean, and I at some point, if a cop is able to, I mean, there was a case that I just heard yesterday in Canada where a judge, and this wasn't a jury trial, a judge basically cleared a white police officer of all charges in the beating death of a Black man, where the cop was using those tantamount to brass knuckles, these gloves with the loaded knuckles and the plates in the knuckles. He beat him, and the man died of blunt force trauma, including having his entire front of his face destroyed. And the cop said, well, I can't say that use of force wasn't justified. So he cleared him of all charges. I mean, there was just no freaking way. He even tried to go so far as to say, I'm not sure that the cause of death was the damage to his, to his sinus area. And of course, the cause of death was blunt force trauma in general. But this is a judge clearing a white cop of all charges. I mean, all charges. In the beating death of a Black man, where he was using, again, a disproportionate amount of force, using, and I don't even know if these gloves are legal in most countries. But I know that there are American cops that are. I mean, I was confronted by a police officer at a I Don't Know More rally, and at the end, when all we had a peaceful resolution to the conflict, and we got physical with each other. And I shook his hand. I could feel that he had those weighted gloves on, that he had those loaded gloves on. And I'm not even sure that they're legal.
I also, if folks are, interested in like the theory or the larger discussion about this, a book that I really recommend is by Peter Gelderloos, and it's called How Nonviolence Protects the State. And the entirety of this book, it really breaks down both historically, theoretically, and through methodology how nonviolence has been used as to placate or to deafen the movement, and that it actually doesn't actually move forward any movement. That's not its intention. Nonviolence is so that people can go into a space, do a nonviolent march, and then go back home and nothing has changed. That there hasn't actually been an upheaval in these larger systemic issues like police violence, like carceral systems, like systemic racism. So I highly recommend that book in terms of if folks are interested, and folks should be interested, if you're interested in broadening this discourse about how nonviolence protects the state. It doesn't make change. It's not meant to make change. We have to make this change, and that requires violence. It requires what we define as justice after years, hundreds of years of genocide.
Well, and here's the problem. I mean, when we use words like justice, and we don't acknowledge the systemic racism that is tied to the U.S. justice system. I mean, look at these Proud Boys, these white supremacists, these so-called militias that have the support and the backing of the police departments. I mean, if those guys can show up someplace armed to the teeth and threatening with their weapons and that kind of stuff, and not face any threat back, if they don't face some level of pushback, and look, it's not like they haven't done anything. They've killed a few people, they've shot some people. I mean, and unarmed people at that. So the whole thing is, when push comes to shove, I would put my money on frankly on street gangs over the Proud Boys any day if push came to shove. But at some point, there has to be an equal force that meets this potential violence that it continues to be inflicted against people of color, and in this systemic racist system.
I think this kind of touches on something that I think we should explore further in the future, but I think we could definitely touch on it, is this idea of being armed or having a gun as a person of color. And for a long time, I was very anti-gun. I was like, I don't believe anyone should have guns. And I am thankful that honestly, I've heard that opinion has changed greatly after a lot of conversations with people, with Indigenous and Black people. And the reality now is that I advocate fully for people to be armed, for Black and brown people to be armed, especially considering that there are white militias like Proud Boys, like the Boogaloos, a number of other ones that are armed and have murdered anti-fascist organizers. We saw it in Portland just, 2 months ago. So I think that this idea of arming oneself, which originally, the liberals have been like, oh no, push away from guns in general, and now the left is organizing differently, and it's an interesting conversation. But another reason I bring that up is because it's interesting how being armed is fine until you're a person of color. And my example is Walmart stopped selling guns in many of their stores because people of color were buying the guns.
Exactly.
And when they had white people buying guns, they had no problem with it. But the second people of color started coming in and buying guns, they as an entire corporation have stopped selling guns.
Well, and I got to take this
excellent example of what it looks like when Black and brown people begin to arm ourselves and begin to organize. We see what systemic racism, how it reacts.
Well, and I got to take this home a little bit. I mean, look, we stood up to the provincial Quebec police force in Gunazadage during what people know as the Oka crisis. We shot back and chased them away. They brought in the RCMP, and we stayed armed, and we had a armed standoff with them. They brought in the Canadian Army, and we maintained. Had we not shot back, they definitely would have overrun our people, and lives would have been lost. And frankly, they would have expanded their 8-hole or their 9-hole golf course to an 18-hole golf course. So as Native people, as warriors, look, I know that we have to be armed. I mean, and we can have all these conversations about gun control and that kind of thing in certain circumstances. But as a Native person who I know the significance of arming ourselves, the reason we don't get overrun in many of our territories by outside police forces is because they know that we are armed. And we've demonstrated our willingness to defend ourselves with those arms. So, I I'm not gonna run around, brandishing weapons every place that I go, like like these white boys do. But at the end of the day,
Oh yeah.
yeah, I'm gonna make sure that I can defend myself.
Yeah, I think that it's definitely something that within my own radicalization is an opinion that I've changed greatly, where I I was like, no one should have guns. But then the reality is, like, police shouldn't exist anyway. They should not be armed. And that we should be, especially in a time where white militants and white militias and white supremacists have the support of the federal government up to the presidency, the whole stand by comment that Trump made during
The debate, yeah.
the debate. Thank you. We are now in a different course in which, as brown and black people, I think arming oneself, being trained on how to properly and securely have weaponry, to like really to honor that in its own practice is something that I didn't think I would ever come to. And now I am at that point, and it's a really interesting conversation to see what it looks like to how the general public reacts to black and brown people being armed.
Well, and again, I come back to this thing about shooting back. I mean, and the conversation starts with this idea of revenge or vengeance, and I still bring it back to this idea of equity. And look, I'm not promoting an arms race, the whole nuclear weapon thing being the deterrent, but at the end of the day, I know that the outside police forces that have threatened our territories with everything from imposing their tax regimes and criminalizing our commerce and all that stuff, the only reason we have the level of autonomy that we have is because we have demonstrated as Native people, at least in the territories that I'm associated with, our willingness to fight back. And so, look, it is what it is. But, I also still come back to, the fact that many will ignore the fact that there is this notion of vengeance that cops display every single day. I mean, when you see a cop get violent with somebody, like Sandra Bland, because she wouldn't put her cigarette out because they felt like they were somehow dishonored by a woman. I mean, it's this is where when somebody calls us out to say, well, how do you feel about crossing that line between vengeance and justice? And that's not the question that we need to be posed. That needs to be posed against us. That's the question that needs to be posed against police officers. It needs to be posed against politicians who okay this kind of crime, including advancing things like crime bills and mandatory prison sentences and all of that stuff. I mean, that's where I see vengeance playing out against predominantly non-white people. Yeah,
I'll just echo what I said earlier, which is that I'm thankful the question was asked because it's led to this larger discourse and this larger conversation. But I do agree with you in terms of like it is. What does justice look like to people that aren't you and I, and how do they find justice within the justice system? Like, how can you look at the justice system and feel as though that is a just system, knowing that it's problematic, knowing that it's based in racism, knowing that it's non-sustainable, knowing that it's knowing all of its issues? How can you still support the justice system? How can you still support police? How can you still I want to kind of flip the question back onto the listeners and just say, do you see the justice system as just? And if so, how? Because how could you possibly see it as a just?
If the taking of a life is only justified by one side of that, that proverbial scales of justice, if only one side can execute, and whether it's an execution like the Dakota 38 experienced, or so many people on death row, or if it's execution at the hands of a police officer, that is never met with this notion of justice. And in fact, when we have conversations about things like restorative justice, where where we take a completely different look and say, look, if we want to try to restore, I mean, in our language, we say skana, and it means, some people say it means peace, but it means the process of restoring harmony, and it's about restorative justice. That's what the skana is meant to promote. The idea that we have to restore balance. And I don't know how, if only one side has the legal right to take lives, the other side is always considered murder. It's always considered manslaughter. It's always considered, an offense. But police can justify use of force, and the courts back them up. The politicians back them up. All these back the blue flags we're seeing all over the place in the midst of this election cycle. I mean, what we see is a disproportionate use of violence, and it's like the state has the right to use violence, but we don't have the right to push back. I mean, and that's the problem with this whole idea of justice versus equity.
No, I wonder if this is something that at another time we can have callers call in and with thoughts, because I truly want to know those who accept the justice system, how they could do so.
I think that's a great idea.
Understand.
I think it's a great idea. Look, we're off next week. We're on the cycle of being off every so many weeks for fundraising and that kind of thing. But when we come back, we should plan on doing a show where we we just bring in callers and talk about the subject. I think it's that would be a great conversation to have, and we try where we try to get through as many callers as possible to go through that. Look, a couple things. I want to thank. I was on with Michael G yesterday on his morning show, Living for the City, and I want to thank him for inviting me on. We were talking about the voter suppression. I gave a completely different view of what it looks like. How Native people are used in the election cycle, and whether it's the right or the left, how they put us up on the stage to say, "Oh, look how good we are to the lowly Indians," and it's not about us. And so I talked about that, and it was a really good conversation. So I want to thank Michael G. Haskins for having me on with his Living for the City program. We are going to take a break, and when we come back, I've got Bob Hennelly who's going to join us, and we're going to talk about a variety of things. But one of the things we're going to talk about is Donald Trump, how he utilized Native people to try to rig the gaming laws of New Jersey, and ultimately, for those who don't know, he's basically left Atlantic City in tatters, and in fact. I think it's, and Bob will correct me on this, but a few days after the election cycle, people will be able to gather in Atlantic City to watch the demolition of Trump's Taj Mahal, because that's what it's come to. So we'll take a break, and when we come back, we'll have Bob Hennelly join us for a time. And I don't know if we'll get to any callers today, but we've got a lot to talk about. So. Let me just, before we break, let me just do what the one thing that I have to do, which is to remind people that we are listener-supported radio. We need your support. We need your contributions to the to WBAI. If you do it in the name of this program, I greatly appreciate it. And of course, the program is now Resistance Radio. So I ask you to go to the pledge line, 516-620-3602. Make a donation in the name of Resistance Radio. That donation goes to WBAI. It helps us with everything from our guys like Reggie and Michael G to paying our rent and our utility bills, basically the cost of being on the air. So again, go to the pledge line, 516-620-3602. Make a donation of any size in the name of Resistance Radio. We'll take a break, and we'll be right back. This is John Kane and Regan DeLoggins, and this is Resistance Radio. All right, thanks for coming back. Hey, that's Murray Porter with Highway 16. That's his song that is dedicated missing and murdered Indigenous women. I got to give props to Michael G. He even allowed me to elaborate a little bit more on that subject during his program Living for the City yesterday. So I greatly appreciate that. John Kane here with Resistance Radio with Regan DeLoggins. We are to be joined by Bob Hennelly, who is a pretty well-known investigative journalist in the New York City area. He has written for Salon and City and State and Inside New Jersey, and I guess if Robert, you can add a few more accolades to that if you if you'd like. I greatly appreciate you joining Regan and I for the program.
Well,
yes, welcome, Bob.
Honor. Thank you. It's a privilege and honor, and just the only the chief leader.
Chief leader, that's one.
My mainstay, because that's where I got my health care. And today, I guess that's where we figure out work, right? We'll work for health care.
That's who owns you, right? Your health care. Bob, you did a great piece where you really kind of exposed just the devastation that Donald Trump wreaked on Atlantic City. You brought up the fact that there will be a demolition of the Taj Mahal, I believe it is, shortly after the election.
It's the plaza.
The plaza. Okay, the Trump Plaza. Okay, all right.
Yep.
One of the things that you also pointed out, and from a Native standpoint, I think it's worth mentioning is how much he cried foul about Native gaming and how he used what he touted as this incredibly unlevel playing field for him to kind of skate through and manipulate, if not gut some of New Jersey's gaming regulations, which allowed him to basically not just become a casino license holder, but to fail miserably at it.
Right. Well, first I have to give a shout out. There are three journalists who preceded my efforts here, and that's Timothy Bryan and David K. Johnson and the late Wayne Barrett, who's a colleague of mine at the Village Voice. It's important to know that we never reinvent the wheel. We stand on the shoulders of others, and in real time, particularly Wayne, David K. Johnson back in the 80s, were writing about all this. They were writing about this ongoing crime scene that was visible from space in Atlantic City, where Donald Trump was able to turn the entire political apparatus into like something you'd see in a dictatorial banana republic. He managed to convert the entire regulatory structure, the political and media elites, to be his squires and run roughshod over all these regulations, and at the same time was able to do this thing where, with the help of Congressman and Senator Torricelli, beat up on Native gaming. In a recent account now about McCain's life, apparently Trump was just beside himself in Washington at the hearing, and then Senator McCain, who was supportive of Native gaming, and Trump actually exchanged some nasty words. But Trump was always saying, and his supporters were saying, "Hey, I'm a legitimate businessman, and here's the fun part: trying to pay his taxes." Emphasis added. And here are these so-called sovereign nations who don't look like Indians to me. That's a direct quote. And he did that for years, and no one held him to account for it.
Well, and again, it's ironic that he tried to play all this tax paying issue, because clearly he hasn't paid much in the way of taxes. In fact, not only does he not pay taxes, because of the how often he's used the bankruptcy code to protect himself, he's actually a complete net loss to contributing back to to any kind of public finance, because he has cost not only through the bankruptcy protection and all of the vendors that he failed to pay, but by filing bankruptcy in the way that he did, he basically takes money out of the system and put very little back. And when you juxtapose that against how regions have benefited from native gaming, I mean, native gaming there may be no better example of dollars that come into a region and stay in a region than when you look at the models that have been created by native gaming. So yeah, there's a real irony, and of course the story in the news is how he paid taxes in China but paid no taxes in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think this reveals, and this is on Insider NJ, this particular story, and it took quite a bit of research because I tracked the role of the officials, the elected, and this was bipartisan. That's another thing to understand, that the way that he was able to get inside New Jersey gaming was a consequence that you had someone like Governor Florio, who after he was in office actually served on the board for Trump's publicly traded corporation for 2 years. Governor Florio did speak with me, and he said that he was exposed to the kind of dysfunctional behavior that we saw during the debate where Vice President Biden couldn't get at a word in edgewise. And then I also spoke with Senator Torricelli about his role of advocating for Trump, and he justified at the time saying that Trump was one of the largest employers in the state of New Jersey at the time. But then he went on to condemn New Jersey. He said that New Jersey had failed to properly regulate Trump, and pointed out that, and this is, I asked him if he thought it was a form of regulatory capture, and he basically agreed with me, and that's the concept in law of where a business entity, an individual or a corporation, or a series of corporations becomes so important to the state and the elite's economic functioning that they actually are captured by the likes of Donald Trump, the Buccaneer. And I submit to you that that's what's happened to the entire American economy over the arc of my last 20 years.
Well, the too big to fail is an example of that, but and absolutely, and I think it's a point worth taking that when as much as Trump commands the attention that he gets, I still go back to the same thing. I mean, he's a symptom of a bigger problem, and both parties have pandered to Donald Trump. I mean, you don't have to look very hard to find the pictures of Bill and Hillary Clinton at his wedding, and the way he and Trump's father played the system, the political system, to basically, to in both New York and New York City, and New Jersey. I mean, it's pretty well documented.
Yeah, it is. And I think one of the things that going forward is that, as you rightly say, that this whole question of the nature of the political economy, Trump is merely a symptom of it. And we make a big mistake if we assume that by turning him out, which we must, their work is done. In some ways, the heavier lift comes when we're going to have to deal with, hopefully, the Democratic Party, because within the Democratic Party are the same elements that has made Donald Trump possible.
Absolutely. I mean, you talked extensively about how the so-called recovery under Obama seemed to miss so many people, especially people of color. I mean, there's no question about how much the Democrats have also, pandered to this, insatiable diet that capitalism commands. And you're right. I mean, anybody who thinks that just changing the name tags is going to make a big difference. I mean, the hope that some people should have is that they can, that Biden may be more malleable, to the kinds of change than Trump is. The jury's still out in my mind on much of this stuff, but and as much as I think that Trump is among the worst human beings that have ever sat in the White House, he probably isn't the worst. He's just among them, and it's going to be interesting to see if anybody really wants change or they just want name changes.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that the thing that we have to keep our eye on here is that our national circumstance with well over 300,000 individuals, depending on how you count it, having died from COVID, millions exposed, and dealing with the situation where the very milquetoast but important protection that's in the Affordable Care Act that was passed by President Obama for pre-existing conditions, that could be done away with. And the fact that there's so little discussion about the implications of this for the first responders and frontline healthcare workers. I mean, this just validates how little regard people have to these people that the media makes these, gauzy movies about when they die. But in life, they ignore them. The consequence of getting rid of their pre-existing protection will be devastating for frontline first responders and healthcare professionals who, in this particular pandemic, have not only exposed themselves and sometimes paid the highest price for caring for others, but exposed their entire family.
And they are disproportionately black and brown people.
Exactly. And so we don't see we'll see the lovely music at the end of the program, we'll cry a tear. But as far as looking at how this racist mechanism chews them up in their families, well, we're not going to get too negative.
Right. Well, and then when you combine what this pandemic, COVID-19, with the whole idea of underlying conditions and how much they seem to exasperate each other, you're right. This notion that and there's no question that Trump is trying to gut the ACA, and there's also very little question that that Biden has staunchly opposed universal health care. The interesting thing is that, and you brought it up in our conversation today, that look, if Trump has success with this Supreme Court nominee and a few other things that can transpire before the end of his presidency, should he lose the election, we may see that universal health care almost comes by force, because there's no other way to stop people from dying in the streets.
Well, and what's happening is that also very early on in this epidemic, and I would say the chief leader, I'm very grateful to be part of that organization that's been reporting on civil service and unions since 1897 there. I got a commercial break in. And one of the things that early on I was hearing from Local 2507, FDNYMT, Local 3621, which represents EMS officers, was how many people were dying in their homes. And when they normally would experience 25 to 30 cardiac fatals a day, they were seeing close to 300.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we can't say that all those were COVID, but meanwhile, Governor Cuomo has certainly done a better job than President Trump, but even Governor Cuomo was making the focus the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a profound misunderstanding of the public health imperative, that the disease is in the community. And these were lessons we learned 1918 to 1920, and we came away with basic understandings like, here's one, an oldie but goodie, put a registered nurse in every public school. Mm-hmm. You probably remember that, an oldie but goodie.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we decided to do away with that for a few decades, particularly in communities of color, and we could have circuit nurses driving around to 10 schools. That would be fine.
Put an armed officer, a resource officer, but we'll take away the nurse. Yeah, what does that say about where society has gone? But you bring up a good point, Bob, and we talked about this early on in this pandemic, because you were one of the people that was actually talking to coroners about, because there was always debate on whether there were this many people really dying. Finally, now we're seeing some of this information that has basically been forced from foreign analysis that there in all likelihood over 300,000 people have died, because they're doing the analysis based on looking at how many people die on a yearly basis and how much that spiked this year. And they've attributed 2/3 of that 300,000 to dying directly of COVID-19. But you're right, with Cuomo putting such an emphasis, and this whole thing about flattening the curve was to prevent a run on hospitals. Well, you know what else prevented a run on hospitals? Fear of going to the hospitals. And that's why so many people died in their homes of heart attacks and so many strokes and so many other things, that they actually made the choice to avoid getting medical attention because of the fear that was generated by going to the hospitals.
But also, I think that it's important to note that there is an incredible amount of medical racism.
Right.
And so a lot of people of color avoid going to the hospital because of the way that we are treated within the hospital, or even within urgent care, even ambulances treat us there's a constant skepticism in terms of our pain, our illnesses, our the way that we are perceived by society, and therefore we do not receive proper medical attention. So for Black and brown people to avoid going to the hospital during COVID, for me, is a reminder of why groups like Black Panthers and Young Lords created their own free healthcare clinics with their own nurses, with their own doctors, because we can't rely on settler state medical care. We cannot be relying on settler state dependency any longer. So for me, yes, universal health care, I would love that for everyone. But I also would love for us not to have to rely on dependency on the settler state for medical care. We should have localized free clinics, localized free hospitals. And I understand that for a lot of people that seems like a difficult world to imagine. But the reality is that is possible. So people dying at home, especially Black and brown people during the height of COVID, it's not just, fear of being in the hospital because of COVID. It's also fear of being in the hospital because you're a Black or brown person in a hospital. They don't treat us the same way. We just saw a First Nations woman murdered by hospital staff in French Canada.
Mm-hmm.
Like there are realities beyond just general fear of COVID.
And the statistics don't lie. I mean, and they've done this even before determining that Black and brown people are dying at a higher rate due to COVID. Just the mortality rate associated with childbirth, it was striking, and and Cuomo was forced to acknowledge it, although there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of things in place to change it, and that's directly to your point, Regan.
Well, I would also say that it's important to look at the fact that in an eerie historical parallel, for 3 years prior to the pandemic, American life expectancy declined. And that first time that had happened was leading up to the pandemic, the Spanish flu pandemic, which, of course, is only called Spanish flu because Woodrow Wilson prevented any discussion of it in the media because it would hurt the war effort, and Spain didn't have the same censorship requirement. So
right.
Your point, Reagan's well taken, that there is this built-in, and we see it particularly in terms of infant mortality and maternal outcomes. It is something that has been baked in. I will tell you, at least in my experience as a New York City reporter, that the EMTs are primarily women and people of color who are the advocates for what is the only medicine that people see often because of the things you describe institutionally. And they were saying months before anyone else, you must get the health care into the community and work with the community to heal itself. And I think your orientation is exactly right, that it has to be authentically connected to the community it's designed to serve, and that community has to design that architecture. Is that your point?
Well, and we also see the historic number of hospital closures. I live in a Native community. The closest hospital to us is shuttered now, so we have to travel to Buffalo, or at least that far to even get to a hospital. And of course, that's the other thing about Native people in particular. Our access to health care is dramatically impacted by the fact that policy has driven Native people into some of the most remote areas off of their ancestral homelands into places that certainly don't have the services. I don't know, Regan, you got any final thoughts before we let Bob go and close up here? Regan, are you there? Did I lose you?
I don't know.
All right. Well,
I'm gonna try. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Bob, I first off, I want to thank you again for joining me. It's always a pleasure to have you join me on the program. We tackle issues, and oftentimes, and we see it time and time again, there are things that we talk about that don't get picked up by the mainstream media for months. And so I'm glad we
just 90 days. That's my rule, John. Take this, bury it away for 90 days. And I'm at Stuck Nation, and so I'm always open to any stories related to abusive managers, efforts of people trying to unionize or corrupt unions. We take it all.
You and I are going to collaborate. We're going to do a piece together here. We've talked about it.
We are.
We're going to put something together here, and we'll bring you back, and we'll talk about the program.
Before we close out, though, first, thank you so much for your time. I got disconnected for a second. Really appreciated having you on the show today. But the thing that I did want to close out on is I want to remind folks how important it is in order to break dependency away from the settler state, in order to break away from, medical racism, really advocate for supporting your local mutual aid groups and organizations. We often provide food and medical services, including harm reduction materials, PPE, hygiene materials, things like that, and as well as training on street medic training. So I really advocate for folks out there to start doing that research and to get more involved and support your mutual aid network.
Absolutely, great idea, and thank you for bringing that up. We can talk about significant and severe medical conditions, but that's not what most of us face on a daily basis. Some of the stuff can be easily addressed, and these mutual aid organizations do a tremendous benefit to communities, and we need more support for them, and we need more of them. So thanks for bringing that up. Hey, I want to remind people again, we are listener-supported radio. We do require your donations to make WBAI continue and to exist. So please go to the pledge line. It's 516-620-3602. That's the number to call to be a donor, to be a part of the WBAI family. You can become a BAI buddy by agreeing with your credit card or your checking account to make a monthly contribution. Do it in the name of Resistance Radio, and Regan and I will love you forever. If you want to do a one-time donation, that's welcome as well. You can go to the website, which is www.give2, that's GIVE, the number 2, WBAI.org, and you can follow the prompts on how to make a donation there. Again, none of the donations to WBAI in the name of our program go to Regan and I. They go to the station. We really need you to support the station. So we will be off next week. I think they'll put a fundraising program in our place. Look, the more of you that support the radio program that we're delivering, probably the less we will be preempted. But next week will be a preemption, so we'll see you in 2 weeks. So I want to thank my guest, Bob Hennelly, and always I want to thank the great Regan DeLoggins for being a part of this team. And we'll be back with more Resistance Radio in a couple of weeks. Yahweh.